We're in the group stages of the Chessable Masters, and first game up today was Magnus Carlsen against Hikaru Nakamura. These two resumed their great rivalry. Pretty orthodox start by both players. Carlsen playing a pretty standard opening for once with white. It's the bishop f4 variation, queen's gambit decline. In fact, these two have done battle in this exact variation. And here, of course, e3 is the normal move for white. Instead, Carlsen played a3, bit of a slice serve, trying to catch out Nakamura. Now, I think b6 is a reasonable move here for black, but Nakamura went with the standard knight bd7, and now knight b5. So this is starting to get a bit weird and wacky. The knight and the bishop hitting that pawn on c7, which has to be defended. Knight e8, e3, and Nakamura took on c4, bishop takes c4, and c5 from Nakamura. He hit out here. a6 and b5 has been played before, maybe that's a bit better, but c5 played seems pretty standard to try and break down white's centre. D takes c5 by Carlsen, a6. Now, instead of going back to c3, Carlsen was able to put the knight on d4, slightly more active square. Nakamura recovered the pawn with bishop takes c5, castles. And now the move that you really want to make here with black is pawn to b5 to free that bishop. But here, after b5, white would just launch in and sacrifice a piece, and actually has tremendous compensation in that position. So instead of that, instead of b5, Nakamura played queen e7 to cover that e6 pawn. Rook c1, putting a rook on the open file, looks good. And there's a bit of a trick here. If pawn to e5, in fact, white is fine because of bishop g5. So bishop d6, Nakamura already very congested. You can see white's pieces, well, very harmoniously placed. These pieces stuck on the back rank, not looking good. So after this move, bishop a2, just dropping that bishop back, and now the rook is looking pretty good on this open file. And this exchange here, well, that could even help white. Opens up the e-file, maybe f5 could come later. Knight df6. It's pretty awkward when these knights kind of tread on each other's toes. And knight e5 looking very strong for white already. Here, maybe knight d5 is the best move, but knight d7 played. That knight having to hop back again. But it's not good, and Carlsen uncorked a beautiful move here. Knight dc6, and Nakamura is reeling after this one. Well, first things first, we have to look and see what happens if pawn takes knight. Well, we play knight takes, so you can see the knight attacks the queen. If the queen moves up, let's say queen h4, then bishop takes bishop. You want to take that rook, so knight takes, queen takes. White is already a pawn up in this position, not a queen up, a pawn up. And this knight and the queen, well, they just dominate black's pieces here. These pieces just aren't getting out. Already, I would say, a winning position. So this is the point of knight c6. Nice tactic. The knight attacks the queen. The queen has to move away, and this is really uncomfortable. Queen h4 played by Nakamura. Bishop g3. That queen is now running a bit short of squares. Queen g5. h4, and now, well, we can see some really nice tactics in the position. Supposing Nakamura tried queen h6 here. I should say this did not happen. He actually played queen f6. Then we have knight g4 attacking the queen again. It's running out of squares. And if queen g6, now watch out, bishop takes bishop. And if knight takes bishop, we have knight e7 check, forking king and queen. Well, that is typical. There are so many tricky tactics in this position. And after h4, queen f6 by Nakamura. Knight g4 hits that queen again. Once more, if that queen heads here, then it's going to end up in trouble with some nasty check after an exchange here. So Nakamura decided, right, he's just went all in, grabbed that pawn on b2. But then bishop takes bishop. This is still really problematic. So if knight takes bishop, we give a check on e7 again, king h8. Queen takes knight, so at the moment white is a piece up, and if black takes the bishop on a2, then knight takes c8, and that wins a piece. You can see if black captures here, the knight drops on d7. So this is the problem. Nakamura is just dropping material. Now, he grabbed the knight on c6, rook c2, first of all, attacks the queen, drives the queen away before taking material. The queen slipped back to b5. Bishop takes rook on f8. Lots of captures here, lots of tactics. But now, I mean, basically the position has settled and we can just take stock of this one. So Carlsen has a rook against a knight. Nakamura has an extra pawn, but it's not much of a pawn. That pawn is isolated and weak on c6, and this is basically just a winning position for Carlsen. And what's more, black's position is just rotten. Look at all those pieces stuck on the back rank. They're not even in the game at all. The only piece developed is the queen on b5, and frankly, that can be a liability. I was expecting just queen d4 in this position. It looks such a dominating, centralizing move, ready to play maybe rook c5 or just bring rook number 2 into the game, rook b1 and rook c1. But Carlsen, he's so tricky. He played h5. Now, when you're running short of time, this one is a tough one to meet. That pawn perhaps wants to advance to h6 just to prise open black's king position. Queen takes pawn is possible. Knight f6 could be met by knight takes knight defending the queen. But queen d8 should be a winning move. Still a little bit tricky, but queen d8 must win. But after h5, well, Nakamura believed Carlsen, and he just played the kind of safety first move, h6, stopping the pawn advancing and giving the king a back-ranked escape square. Now queen f3, and Carlsen is back on track. So preparing perhaps rook number 2 to come into the game. If, for example, bishop d7, then this rook can slide across to one of these squares. Should be winning for white. In the meantime, that pawn is under fire. So Naka very quickly just decided to take that. Once again, knight f6 doesn't work because that knight actually protects the queen. But Carlsen played queen takes c6, and this is a winning move. Rook threatened, knight threatened. Last try from Nakamura, he played knight to c7. So the knight just covers that rook, and if queen takes knight here, then queen takes knight, and black kind of limps on. It's a pretty dire position, but actually Carlsen has a really neat winning move here. So many tactics in this game. Queen f3. So that queen has gone from f3, took on c6, and went back again to f3. So what's the point of this move? Well, now it uncovers the line of the rook. So rook takes knight is threatened. It also comes back to this diagonal. So there's a second threat, knight f6. And in this case, you would win the queen. So here, knight d5 is basically the only move. If the knight had gone back to e8 to cover the f6 square, then of course just queen takes rook. So knight d5, only move, blocking this diagonal. covering the f6 square, but now e4 wins. Just want to drive the knight away. If knight e7, we've still got this knight f6 check winning the queen. And after e5, no need to take here because then bishop takes knight and black struggles on. But here, Carlsen practically instantly played knight h6 check. And that was the end of the game. Nakamura resigned. If queen takes knight, then bishop takes. Bishop threatens the rook. Queen takes pawn, threatened. And if rook a7, then this bishop hangs. And white is a rook up with a completely winning position. Wow, what an absolute crush. So many tactics there. And I think Nakamura was just thrown by this move a3 and just never found his footing. But, you know, he just sort of spun from tactic to tactic there. And Carlsen just played wonderfully. A fantastic initiative. So Carlsen fights back in their rivalry.